The Russian-Ukraine war is the current Cuban Missile Crisis of today. In this podcast, learn how overly pessimistic perceptions about the intentions of potential opponents tends to become self-fulfilling prophecies. In this podcast, we ask how the United States would react if the shoe were on the other foot. That is, if Russia acted towards the United States as the West has acted towards Russia. What were the implications for Russian security of the American withdrawal from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Missile Treaty? Didn't U.S. foreign policy experts publicly warn that NATO expansion would lead to disaster? Why are those responsible for NATO's failed expansion policy now doubling down on their mistakes? Did provocations place Russia in an untenable situation for which war seemed to Putin and his military staff the only workable solution? In the end, who bears primary responsibility for the ongoing disaster in Ukraine? Find out on Emir Phillips, American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
Were these Western assurances legally binding in a capacity?
Technically, no, not binding, legally, but come on, what about morally, ethically? I mean, this is ridiculous. The former idea about moving, closer to Soviet borders is written down, not in treaties. That is true, Levi, but it is written in multiple memorandum of conversations between the Soviets and the highest level of Western leaders, Genscher, Kohl, Baker, Gates, Bush, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Major, Warmer, and others. Ridiculous. They gave assurances throughout 90, 91, 92 about protecting Soviet security interests, including the USSR, in new European security structures. The two issues, one, Soviet security interests, and two, new European structures, they're related but not the same. I think subsequent analysis sometimes conflates the two issues, and argue that the discussion did not involve all of Europe. But I believe the declassified documents published, they show clearly it did. It did involve all of Europe, and therefore it clearly includes the Ukraine.
I mean, so does this violation here, do any of these assurances fully explain Russia's invasion of Ukraine specifically?
I would say it's the first domino to fall, and I'd say the dominoes start falling now. We're on our way. We're on the road to destruction.
All right, then. So is it then fair to say that the West acted in a calculated way to deceive Moscow? Is that kind of where it's headed?
I think whether it was initially, whether Bush and them acted in good faith or believed what they were saying, we won't know for sure. I'd like to give the Western leaders the benefit of the doubt, so maybe we can. But I would say what we've alluded to so far laid the foundation, for an evolving sense in Moscow, a legitimate evolving sense that NATO and the U.S. in particular, specifically the United States, they couldn't be trusted. So calculated to deceive Moscow. I mean, for sure, Moscow sincerely believed we can't trust these guys by 98 and 2000. No way. And by 2008, yeah, deception.
All right. I think we should be a little more specific here. Can you get a little more specific about this distrust and everything else here?
Okay. Well, you remember the Warsaw Pact was in Poland. It was the centerpiece of the Soviet Empire's defense. So the first decisive step occurred, I would argue, in 1999 when NATO decided to bring in Poland. I would say that's a critical one.
Okay. All right. So taking that into account, my history tells me, that the Russians would be very worried, not so much because NATO was hostile at the time, but because they knew that Poland had a long history of hostility towards Russia and, vice versa.
Yeah, I mean,
you know.
Poland actually, in my opinion, won a war against the Russian Revolution in 1920, which I was actually happy they did because I'm a fierce opponent of communism. So, and Poland had been mistreated by Russia. There's no argument, and I think the Poles have been beaten up and down the street by the Russians. So I don't blame the Poles for having animosity, but the Russians don't want Poland used as a tool against them either. So, the inclusion of Poland in the NATO was a potential catalyst for war with Russia because Poland's already wired to go to war with Russia because they're pretty pissed off about the Warsaw Pact, and I don't blame them. So this is a very volatile situation. Very.
All right. It's like, I guess, what's the next domino after that?
For me, and I gave the U.S. and the West, since I am an American, the benefit of the doubt. You notice this from 1990 all the way to 99. I mean, I'm giving a lot of leeway here that I don't think Putin and the Russians would give, but as an American, I'm going to give my president the benefit of the doubt. But in 2001, President George W. Bush, he unilaterally, which I referred to earlier, withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM treaty. Then in 2004, NATO admitted additional East European countries. And now even I'm having problems. I personally could have allowed Germany, East Germany into NATO. I even was okay, and I was at the time okay with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary because they had rebelled against the Soviet Empire. Poland with the Pope, they fought against them with solidarity. Czechoslovakia in 1968, Hungary 1956. So letting them into NATO, I completely empathize with, even though it would raise Russian ire, and even though it goes against our assurances. I can see both sides of the street here on that because I'm a fierce opponent of communism. To be honest, my view is the only good communist is a dead communist. So I'm sympathetic towards it. But here we are in 2004, when you start admitting Romania, Estonia, the latter of which borders on Russia, even I'm starting to go, whoa. Houston, we have a problem.
So just taking it all in, it's a lot. It's pretty remarkable, by just like at this point, NATO had expanded, close to 1,000 miles towards Russia, very much backtracking on whatever minute promise they made before. So,
yeah, I mean, that's a lot of territories. It looks like Napoleon or Hitler marching to Moscow from a Russian point of view that by now hasn't been communist for 14 years. After World War II, we forgave, I guess, and rebuilt Japan, and they did Pearl Harbor. We forgave and rebuilt Germany, and we lost over 200,000 people in World War II. The Russians never killed any Americans. I mean, despite the Cold War, we never clashed face to face. We fought proxy. So the Russian view is we surrendered. We didn't fight you. We didn't kill you. You rebuilt Japan, and they did Pearl Harbor. You rebuilt Germany. We surrendered voluntarily, and you got us for our resources through the drunk American puppet Boris Yeltsin from 1990 to 1998. And then you keep adding countries to NATO as you march 1,000 miles towards Russia while our economy collapses in 1998. And our ex-leader, Gorbachev, is living in the Presidio, a naval base, and is a billionaire. The Americans gave Gorbachev $1 billion, and he's living in a Russian base, and he can't talk. So our leader has abandoned us and lives in a naval base under the bridge, the Golden State Bridge in San Francisco, where everyone can see we're leaderless, a puppet's running us, our resources are being stolen, our economy and pensions have crashed, we're hungry, you're marching NATO toward us. I mean, this isn't looking good. And when the Russians get back on their feet, which they did under Putin by about 2008, well, things are going to change. And it does, because in 2008 at a NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, NATO announced in the so-called Bucharest Memorandum that it intended to admit Ukraine and Georgia as members. And by now, Russia's not destroyed and broken as they were in 1998. It's a new Russia by 2008 because Putin has resurrected Russia economically reasonably well, not perfectly.
Yeah, and just to kind of speak, a little bit more to Ukraine and Georgia, both those new members that were just added at that time, they're both these countries are on the border of Russia as well.
Yeah. And even though European members of NATO, they had serious reservations. They did. The administration of President George W. Bush, he used the position in the United States as a senior member of the alliance. Also, we bankroll the whole thing to push the issue, and the following unequivocal statement was included in the memorandum. And I quote, We agreed today that these countries, Ukraine and Georgia, will become members of NATO. At that moment, Levi, we're headed to war. We're headed to
Yeah.
war.
Yeah, by that time, no formal action to actually admit those countries was taken, though.
But from the start, Russia viewed the serious discussion of NATO entry of Ukraine and Georgia as existential threats to their existence. Ukraine shares a 1,200-mile border with Russia. In a 2008 cable sent to Washington, the then U.S. ambassador to Russia, William J. Burns, who is currently director of the CIA, and I repeat, currently director of the CIA, described his meeting with the Russian foreign minister. Burns noted that Russia considered the entry of Ukraine and Georgia in a NATO is a red line that couldn't be crossed. He was clear. This fact was reflected in the heading Burns gave to his cable. And I quote, and it's a famous cable, by the way, "Niet means niet." Niet is Russian for no. No means no. Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. Burns wrote, and I quote, "Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests." And I'm putting up for our viewers the source.
Yeah, for what I can recall of this scenario, I don't believe it panned out too well in the end.
Hell no, it didn't. In August 2008, 4 months after NATO's announcement about Ukraine and Georgia, Russia's military crossed into Georgia and entered a brief war with Georgian forces. It was called the 5-Day War, or the Russo-Georgian War, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, what was the straw that broke the camel's back in starting this war then?
I'm going to argue the proximate cause, the real cause of Russia's invasion in February was that the Georgian military, which was funded, armed, and trained by the United States, let's be clear, had launched a massive 14-hour artillery and rocket assault on a semi-autonomous Georgian district, South Ossetia. And that district borders on Russia and has close ties to it. And according to an independent investigation commissioned by the EU, this substantiates everything I'm alluding to here. And I'm going to quote here: "Open hostilities began with a massive Georgian artillery attack involving indiscriminate attacks by Georgian forces on populated non-military areas using both multiple launch rocket systems and artillery pieces. The EU report declared the Georgian attack illegal and implied that the entry of Russian troops into Georgia may have been legal under international law as a response to the death of Russian peacekeepers who were stationed in South Ossetia by international agreement." So I don't even think under international law, Russia was the bad guy or necessarily the aggressor in that Russo-Georgian war. But beyond that, when you get the big picture and look at it strategically, it shows Russia is willing to risk international law. Russia is willing to risk war by U.S. trained troops in Georgia to prevent any further NATO expansion, especially in Georgia, Ukraine, towards Moscow. So this is it, man. This is it. I don't know how else to say.
I get some, it's just, once again, it's just always a lot coming in. But you explain pretty damn well, every time. But I guess then the Russian intervention in Georgia was primarily saying to the United States that they would not tolerate a NATO member on their borders. That much is clear, particularly a member that was, hostile towards them. At that time, Georgian government they were very antagonistic.
I think that's that on. I think what we're dealing with now in the Russian-Ukraine war today, Levi, is exactly an organic, logical outcome that Ambassador Burns, who's now head of the CIA under the Biden administration, what he feared, and I'd love to hear his input on this, when he himself said no means no, in the article we just cited again. So I'd love to hear what the head of the CIA and the Biden administration thinks about this war, since he predicted it.
Yeah, I would too. And we've already discussed a lot of stuff now. We have, but I guess look after all of this, it's crazy to ask, but I guess what's the next domino fall? Because the Georgia conflict rather was a while back, and what falls after that that gets us closer to today?
Well, I think we got to now go to the Ukraine, and Ukraine's been through two significant revolutions since it gained independence when the Russian Empire was broken up, and Russia could not stop the U.S.'s push towards Ukrainian independence in 1991. The first revolution occurred in 2004 when the apparent winner of the presidential election, Viktor Yanukovych, a candidate favored by Russia, was unseated. Yanukovych made a political comeback in 2010 when he again won the presidential election. However, Yanukovych was deposed yet again in February 2014 when a U.S.-supported coup d'etat installed a new government in Ukraine. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the candidate pushed by the United States, was installed as prime minister, but would resign 2 years later amid corruption accusations. So, that was pretty odd. So I'm putting up the basis for what I just said. So, the site is why has Ukrainian prime minister suddenly resigned? And I hope our viewers will look at that.
All right, so that happens, and then okay, what's the next one? Give me the next one. Let's just use this momentum. What's the next one?
Now we're starting to the dominoes are falling in a pattern a lot more rapidly. In late 2013 and early 2014, anti-government protests occurred in Independence Square in Kiev. These protests were supported by the U.S. And there was we backed it up. The violence culminated in a coup d'état in which armed far-right, under Putin's view, neo-Nazi Ukrainian ultra-nationalists took over government buildings and forced the democratically elected pro-Russian president to flee the country. John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, described the outcome. The new government in Kiev was pro-Western and anti-Russian to the core, and it contained 4 high-ranking members who could legitimately be labeled neo-fascists. And for our viewers, if you could see any podcasts or YouTubes by Professor John Mearsheimer, I cannot recommend him enough. He is a brilliant scholar who's nailed down the situation better than I have. And in fact, I think better than anyone. I think the only person to compete with Mearsheimer in foreign policy and geopolitics would maybe be Henry Kissinger. But I'm putting up here the site for the viewers to see and some more information and more sites if people want to dig deeper into this part of the problem here. But you need to keep in mind, Levi, that this 2014 Maidan revolution has been portrayed in the mainstream media as a triumph of democracy over oppression. But that's just bullshit. This garbage ignores the fact that the resulting coup d'etat culminated in the removal of a democratically elected leader in Ukraine. In this critical fact, it can't be glibly ignored. It can't. It's the opposite of truth.
So then what was the U.S. involvement in the 2014 Maidan? I think it's called
Maidan Revolution.
Maidan Revolution. Like, tell me more about that. Like, okay. I don't know much about that.
The U.S. worked with and supported Andrei Parubiy, co-founder of the fascist Social National Party of Ukraine, SNPU, who served as the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament from April 2016 to August 2019. The ideology of Parubiy's SNPU, which he co-founded in 1991 with Ole Tyanbach, now the current leader of the ultra-nationalist Svoboda Party, was radical nationalism and neo-Nazism. So they're far right as you could get.
All right, but like, who is Parubiy? I think he said his name was. Like, who is that? Who is this guy?
He's the quote commander of the Maidan Revolution, and they led the various Maidan paramilitary units. Their forces played a key role in the U.S.-backed coup d'etat that led to the overthrow of the democratically elected pro-Russian President Yanukovych.
All right. I guess. So then what evidence is there that the U.S. supported these people or parties in any fashion?
Well, at the time, U.S. Senator John McCain met with ultranational leader Tyanbach in the lead up to the 2014 coup d'etat, and Vice President Joe Biden met with Tyanbach shortly thereafter in April 2014. In June 2017, Parubiy was inexplicably invited to Washington, D.C., where he met with a number of American politicians, including McCain and House Speaker Paul Ryan.
All right. Okay, then I guess thinking all this through, I guess what is Vice President Biden's role, come into play? What does he play in all this madness that you've been talking about?
Well, I mean, it was during these events surrounding the February 2014 coup that Biden, then Vice President under Barack Obama, made his first appearance as a Ukrainian, the power broker in this scenario, since he was appointed as the Obama administration's key man, point man on the Ukraine. So, and I have substantiated that up there for viewers with a site that I hope they will look to as well.
So I guess, okay, cool. So we got that, but I guess what proof do we have of, like, I guess his shenanigans when he was like going through all this? Like, what proof do we have of that?
Well, I'm going to put the proof up there now so people
Yeah.
can see the site. I'm going to answer your question, explain the site I have up there, because on this one, Levi, we have killer proof. The debate's
Okay.
over now. The cat's out of the bag. Everything I've said is really uncontestable. An intercepted phone conversation between Victoria Nuland, and she's the top neocon of all time, who at the time was Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs in the Obama State Department, and then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piet, revealed that the State Department was actively pursuing the ouster of Yanukovych and the installation of opposition leader Yatsenyuk as prime minister. It isn't known exactly when the discussion took place, only that it transpired prior to February 7th, 2014, when the conversation was leaked. During the call, Nuland used an expletive when referring to the European Union, the EU, which created tensions between Washington, D.C. and European capitals. During the leaked conversation, Nuland noted that Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to Vice President Biden, had informed her that, quote, "you need Biden," end quote, for the successful installation of Yatsenyuk. And Nuland concluded by telling Piet that, quote, "Biden's willing," end quote. Sullivan now serves as the national security advisor to President Biden. So President Biden and Nuland were orchestrating to Piet who was going to be placed in power in the new government, and they were actively involved in overthrowing in a violent coup d'etat with neo-Nazi forces a democratically elected pro-Russian Ukrainian government. This is it. We're here now, Levi. We're at the heart of the matter.
Oh, okay. All right. Just give me a second. Give me a second. So much to take in and respond to. All right. So to be clear, the phone call between, I think it was Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, right? Victoria Nuland, her and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piet. Thank you. That has been posted online, for some time now. I mean, you can get it off YouTube.
Yes.
I think right now, if you wanted, you could really type it in. It's right there. But did this, hacked or leaked exchange between them, did it deliver like the way they thought it would, or?
Oh, yes. Oh, to be clear, I should have mentioned that, they succeeded in the coup d'etat, Levi. Just 2 weeks later, after relying on Vice President Joe Biden, on February 22nd, 2014, Yanukovych was removed as president of the Ukraine. Within days, Yatsenyuk, Nuland's preferred candidate and Joe Biden's preferred candidate, was installed as prime minister of Ukraine.
So the U.S. government had effectively assisted in the removal of a democratically elected leader, that was friendly to Russia, within the installation of a leader who was selected by the U.S.
Yeah, the very antithesis of democracy was going on here. Yeah, and the Kremlin, watching these events unfold, didn't wait long to react, annexing Crimea a few days later. It didn't come out of nowhere. Putin's not an insane Hitler expansionist. He annexed Crimea to maintain the warm water ports in the Black Sea, which Russia acquired in the Crimean War in 1856, and is critical to Russia having a warm water port. And they would no sooner give up Sevastopol than we would give up New York City as a port, or Los Angeles, the largest port in the United States. And so for better or for worse, here we are. At the end of the day, by now it should be crystal clear that the U.S. played a key and critical role in all these events we're discussing. And the full extent of its involvement, whether in directly and formulated violence, we may never know. But what is known is that since 1991, the U.S. has poured $5 billion into its chosen pro-democracy courses and causes and coup d'etats, and has worked its way systemically to we're here, culminating in Joe Biden and Nuland backing a coup d'etat to overthrow democratically elected prime minister of Ukraine. And I'm putting up a site there that further buttresses everything we've been discussing, and what was going on behind the scenes a month before the coup to determine who would replace the sitting president in the Ukraine.
All right. So like we've condemned, I think at this point, the mainstream media in this podcast. We've done that at length, and yet we do so, I believe, with good cause, since in this case, the media, predictably focused on the source of the leak and on Nuland's verbal, screw up, I would say, the fuck the EU, sort of thing, but the essential.
That was a direct quote. She literally said,
to be clear, I'm not just saying it was said, fuck the EU. That was there. So sorry for people who are sensitive ears, but that was said. But continuing on now, the essential revelation was that high-level U.S. officials were plotting, to midwife a new anti-Russian government by ousting or neutralizing, at the very least, its democratic system. The elected presidents. They got him out of there.
I mean, so how involved were we in overthrowing this? And then, to what extent the Russians were involved in the Hillary Clinton debacle on the emails? You at least, while you certainly can't agree with the Russians did, you can see why they were so motivated to get payback. But whatever the exact role of the U.S., I think Russia correctly perceived that the U.S. was deeply involved, certainly in laying the foundation for the violent coup d'etat, fomenting the violence, the Maidan Revolution. And in response, and partly out of well-founded concern that the post-coup government or its Western partners might try to block Russia's use of the vital warm water naval port in Sevastopol, Crimea. And by the way, Russia had previously negotiated access to this with the Ukrainian government. To be clear, they were not there under protest. Russia just said, the hell with this, we're going to annex Crimea. We're not losing it. And keep in mind, Crimea's population is 60% Russian and became part of Ukraine only in 1954 when Nikita Khrushchev, a Ukrainian by birth, awarded it as part of its 300-year celebration of Russian agreement with the Cossacks. So Crimea was given to the Ukraine by the Ukrainian Russian leader, Khrushchev, as a gratitude for being with Russia, with the Tsar, part of Russia, core of Russia, heart of Russia, for 300 years. 300 years.
So I guess the annexation of Crimea was essentially a reactive response to the coup, orchestrated by the United States. Is that?
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to quote Professor John Mearsheimer, who cites former ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, who notes that Putin's seizure of Crimea was not planned for long. It was an impulsive move in response to the coup that overthrew Ukraine's pro-Russian leader. Putin was not a Hitler planning this, since he wrote his own Mein Kampf. In fact, until then, NATO expansion was aimed at turning all of Europe into a giant zone of peace, not at containing a dangerous Russia. Once the crisis of Crimea started, however, American and European policymakers could not admit that they had provoked it by trying to integrate Ukraine into the West. They declared that the real source of the problem was Russia's revanchism or nationalism and its desire to dominate, if not conquer, Ukraine. So, and to come back here, I'm going to point viewers to an excellent and comprehensive video lecture by, yet again, Dr. John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, The Causes and Consequences of the Ukrainian War, which I cannot recommend strongly enough that viewers watch.
Yeah. All right. So just to reorient us just a little bit, did the West continue in provoking Russia after 2014?
Well, I've heard arguments fall along the line that since 8 years have passed between the coup in 2014 and Russia's 2022 invasion, we can disregard claims that Putin was motivated by national security concerns, as if there's some sort of 8-year statute of limitations wherein if I don't screw you for over 8 years, you no longer have been wronged. But nonetheless, this assertion is completely false, erroneous, and asinine anyway. So,
Oh, how so? Clarify that just a little bit.
All right. Our provocations of Russia continued after 2014. After Russia took control of Crimea, the U.S. began a massive program of military aid to Ukraine. According to the U.S. Congressional Research Service, a partial accounting since 2014, not including most of the military aid initiated since the 2022 war began, amounts to over $4 billion. most coming through the State Department and Department of Defense. And I'm putting up for our viewers here the site substantiating what I'm saying, that they received $4 billion of aid, that we were already well on our road here to war from 2014 on.
So then what's the point of this military aid to Ukraine? You know, I know the obvious, you know, like with the face value, but what is, I guess, like, in your opinion?
There is a very specific point. You know, from the get-go, the key objective of the funding was to improve interoperability with NATO. NATO wanted to make damn sure when Ukraine went to war with Russia that NATO's equipment would work with Ukrainian military forces. So this is regardless of the fact that Ukraine is not as yet in NATO. NATO is trying to turn Ukraine's military into a NATO member militarily, interoperability with their equipment before they're even in NATO. You know, in 2016, acting on the prior American abrogation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM, the U.S. put into operation an ABM site in Romania. And though ostensibly, legally, technically defensive, the ABM system uses the Mark 41 Aegis missile launchers that can accommodate a variety of missile types, not just ABMs designed to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles, but also, crucially, nuclear-tipped offensive weapons like a Tomahawk cruise missile. Tomahawks have a range of 1,500 miles, can strike Moscow and other targets deep inside Russia, and can carry hydrogen bomb warheads with selective yields up to 150 kilotons, roughly 10 times of the atom bomb that went off in Hiroshima. You know, a similar Aegis site is under construction in Poland and is scheduled for operation now. In fact, I would argue it should be operational by now, further aggravating, pissing off the Russians. The Aegis launchers at each site can accommodate 24 missiles, creating the potential for 48 Tomahawk cruise missiles to be launched at Russia from relatively close range, meaning the end of Russia.
I mean, what is, it's a lot. What is Russia's response been to this, man? Like, what is...
I mean, Putin's been frickin' adamant that the presence of these offensive capable Aegis launchers near Russia's border poses a direct danger to Russia. And in response, the United States asserts that the ABM sites are intended to stop Europe-targeted warheads coming from Iran or North Korea.
I mean, is that true?
Look, given the launcher's potential to function as offensive threats near Russia's border, an American objective in placing these ABM sites, and conceivably the primary objective, seems to me and to Putin, it's meant to apply additional offensive pressure on Moscow while remaining plausible deniability that any such threats intended. So in essence, our response is complete bullshit.
All right. And so, all right. The American response to Putin's concerns, you know, that requires the Russians to trust America's stated intentions, even in a crisis, rather than to judge the threat by the potential of the systems. Is that what we're kind of...
Precisely, you know, and it doesn't help that the Aegis marketing sheet from Lockheed Martin, which makes the launcher, states, and I quote, "The system is designed to accept any missile into any cell, a capability that provides unparalleled flexibility, offense or defense." There's the site. Hopefully the viewers will look it up to substantiate what I am saying.
All right. So, I mean, it's so much, but I know there's more. It's like, because obviously other things happened after. It's like, because we've talked about, what's the next domino after that? What falls next?
The next, in my opinion, 2019, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the 1987 Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons. Furthermore, as The Economist issue of March 11, 2022, which was a great article by The Economist. I give kudos to The Economist because I don't think they do much great anymore, and I recommend all viewers look at it. It made crystal clear the U.S. was not alone in starting to sell lethal weapons to Ukraine. Neither was it alone in coordinating militarily with the Ukraine, even though Ukraine was not yet a NATO member. Professor Mearsheimer notes, and again, I'm citing the March 11, 2022 issue of The Economist. Other NATO countries got in on the act, shipping weapons to Ukraine, training its armed forces, and allowing it to participate in joint air and naval exercises. In July 2021, Ukraine and America co-hosted a major naval exercise in the Black Sea region involving navies from 32 countries. Operation Seabreeze almost provoked Russia to fire at a British naval destroyer that deliberately entered what Russia considers its territorial waters.
I mean, while all this was going on, did they continue to assert that Ukraine would enter NATO? Is that still happening?
The whole time they said it's coming. We can't wait. Come on in, brother. In June 2021, we're getting pretty current here, meeting in Brussels, NATO reaffirmed its commitment, and I quote, "We reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance." And here I'm citing from Brussels summit communique issued by the heads of state and government participating in the meeting of the North Atlantic Council in Brussels, June 14, 2021. Please look up the site. Don't take my word for it.
All right. So we're literally at last year, or kind of 2 years ago at this point. But like, what's the next one? What's the next domino to fall? What's the next?
Well, they're falling fast now. 2 months later, in August 2021, the U.S. Secretary of Defense and the Ukrainian Minister of Defense signed the U.S.-Ukraine Strategic Defense Framework. And I'm citing this to substantiate that. The site is up on the board for viewers to read, and you'll see the U.S. basically giving military assurances to Ukraine, further inciting Ukraine to provoke Russia.
All right, okay, let's stop for a second. I want you to explain, what happened here, because at this point, it sounds like Ukraine's joining out. It sounds like at this point they're definitely joining NATO.
This framework that I've alluded to in the site here translates the NATO pronouncement into a bilateral U.S.-Ukraine policy decision to change the military facts on the ground starting immediately, whether or not Ukraine is a NATO member or not. So the U.S. is making a singular decision here, and whether they're a NATO member or not, they're making military assurances. 9 weeks after that signing, the U.S. Secretary of State and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister signed a similar document, the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. And here I'm citing U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership site, which I hope viewers will look up, please. The document, like the one signed by the Defense Department that I just alluded to earlier, referenced NATO's declarations of 2008 and 2021, and it operationalized those statements bilaterally, starting immediately, regardless of what happened with NATO. Hence, the U.S. obligated itself to come to Ukraine's defense with or without NATO. Hence, President Biden's war. It is Biden's war. And both of these critical documents were executed under Joe Biden's watch. This is Joe Biden's war president, hoping to get reelected through being a war president, since they tend to get reelected.
All right, so how did Russia respond to, this last incident here?